June 6, 1944, 5 a.m. Crisbecq Battery, Normandy coast. The binoculars trembled slightly as Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen swept them across the horizon, recording in his mind an image that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through the pre-dawn gloom, he witnessed something that contradicted every assurance from the High Command. The English Channel, that protective moat that had shielded the Third Reich's western flank, had transformed into a steel highway, an endless armada of vessels stretching from horizon to horizon, their dark silhouettes merging into one continuous mass of approaching doom. The invasion force comprised 6,939 vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 ancillary craft, and 864 merchant vessels, manned by over 195,000 naval personnel from 8 Allied countries. At 5:52 a.m., Ohmsen's battery received the order to open fire. 3 minutes later, at 5:55 a.m., the first shells from his 210mm Czech-made Skoda cannons arced toward the invasion fleet, drops of water against an approaching tsunami. His battery engaged the U.S. cruisers, USS Tuscaloosa and USS Quincy, and the battleship USS Nevada. At 6:30 a.m., his guns would claim the destroyer USS Corrie, the only U.S. destroyer lost on D-Day. From his reinforced concrete observation post atop the Crisbecq battery, the 32-year-old naval officer had just become the first German defender to sight and engage the Allied invasion of Fortress Europe. What Ohmsen saw through his Zeiss rangefinder that morning was not just an invasion fleet. It was the physical manifestation of an industrial capacity that Nazi propaganda had assured him could not exist. The mathematics of defeat were sailing toward him at 8 knots. The transformation had begun. Within hours, German officers across Normandy would witness a demonstration of Allied industrial might that would shatter every assumption about their enemy's capabilities and mark the beginning of the end for Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. The darkness of June 5th had brought ominous signs. At Army Group B headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, 50 miles from the coast, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, since April 15, 1944, monitored increasingly disturbing reports. Rommel himself was absent, in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, convinced the weather was too poor for any invasion attempt. At 1:20 a.m., the 7th Army received notification of massive parachute drops across Normandy. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, numbering over 13,000 men, were being delivered by Douglas C. 47 Skytrains. General der Artillerie Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps from his headquarters in Saint-Lô, understood immediately. A veteran of the Eastern Front who had lost a leg at Stalingrad, Marx possessed the tactical instinct that years of combat had honed to a razor's edge. Yet even Marx, one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced commanders, could not imagine the scale of what was approaching. The German defenders had prepared for an invasion. They had not prepared for an industrial avalanche that would bury them under sheer material superiority. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, appointed as naval advisor to Rommel in November 1943, had spent months inspecting the coastal defences. Born into a naval family in 1894, Ruge understood maritime operations better than any German officer in France. He had pressed for more mines, more obstacles, more guns. But as he would later write in his memoir, Rommel in Normandy, "We were preparing to fight the last war. They were bringing the next one." The German High Command had convinced itself that the Allies could mount an invasion with perhaps 20 divisions, supported by maybe 3,000 vessels. They based these calculations on their own capabilities, their own limitations, their own experience of scarcity and increasing industrial exhaustion after 5 years of war. As the first light of dawn crept across the Normandy coast on June 6th, German observers in bunkers and observation posts from Cherbourg to Le Havre began reporting the impossible. Not hundreds of ships, but thousands. Not a raid or a feint, but the largest amphibious invasion in human history. At Strong Point WN 62, overlooking what would become known as Omaha Beach, Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh peered through his machine gun's embrasure at 5:45 a.m. The 20-year-old farm boy from Metzingen had never seen the ocean before being stationed in Normandy. Now he saw no ocean at all, only steel. "Ships everywhere," Severloh would later write in his memoir. "Big ships, small ships, fat ships with flat bottoms, destroyers racing back and forth like sheepdogs. The horizon was gone. I tried to count but gave up at 100. There were thousands." Across the 50-mile invasion front, German officers and soldiers experienced the same stunning realization. They were facing not just superior numbers, but a different order of magnitude entirely. At 5:30 a.m., the naval bombardment commenced. Available to the fleet were 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors. For the German defenders, it was their first lesson in American industrial mathematics. The USS Texas alone fired 255 rounds from her 14-inch guns in the first hour. Each shell weighed 1,400 pounds. In 60 minutes, one ship had delivered 178 tons of high explosives, more than many German artillery regiments possessed in total ammunition reserves. Before the first soldier set foot on the beaches, the Allied naval forces had fired approximately 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 shells from cruisers, and 3,500 shells from battleships, roughly 130,000 tons of explosive ordnance. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Commander-in-Chief West, would later testify, "We had prepared to fight soldiers. We found ourselves fighting factories." At 6 a.m., as naval shells continued to pulverize the Atlantic Wall, German defenders witnessed the second demonstration of Allied industrial superiority. The sky filled with aircraft, not dozens or hundreds, but thousands. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties in support of the landings, having secured air supremacy prior to the invasion. The Luftwaffe had approximately 300 operational aircraft in all of France. On D-Day, they managed 319 sorties. The Allies flew 14,674. For every German plane in the air, there were 46 Allied aircraft. The mathematics were not just unfavourable, they were absurd. Major Josef Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, made the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion beaches that morning. With just his wingman Heinz Wodarczyk, he strafed Sword Beach once before fleeing from dozens of Allied fighters. This famous incident, documented in multiple historical accounts, demonstrated the complete impotence of German air power. Despite the overwhelming firepower arrayed against them, German defenders at certain positions initially believed they might hold. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division occupied excellent defensive positions on bluffs overlooking the beach. Machine guns in concrete bunkers created interlocking fields of fire. The first waves of American infantry from the 1st and 29th Divisions walked into a slaughter. From the moment the Americans hit the beach at 6:30 a.m., machine gun fire erupted from the resistance nests. Heinrich Severloh, manning an MG-42 machine gun at Widerstands Nest 62, fired over 12,000 rounds that morning, a documented fact from his own testimony. He watched American soldiers fall by the dozens, by the hundreds. Bodies floated in the surf. The beach turned red with blood. For a brief moment it seemed the Atlantic Wall might hold. Then the destroyers came. At approximately 8 a.m., with the situation on Omaha Beach critical and General Omar Bradley considering evacuation, something unprecedented occurred. American destroyers, ignoring the risk of grounding or mines, closed to within 1,000 yards of the beach, point-blank range for naval guns. The USS McCook, USS Carmick, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt turned their 5-inch guns on individual German strongpoints. At such range they couldn't miss. This action, well documented in naval records, proved decisive in breaking the German defence at Omaha. This was the moment German officers began to understand the true meaning of American industrial might. It wasn't just the number of ships, it was the willingness to risk them, to use them as expendable assets. The destroyer USS Corrie was lost, but immediately others took its place. Ships were not precious, irreplaceable assets as they were for the Kriegsmarine. They were tools, and America had thousands more. As the morning progressed, German observers witnessed something that defied their understanding of amphibious operations. The landing craft kept coming. Wave after wave, hour after hour, an endless conveyor belt of men and material flowing from sea to shore. The variety of specialized vessels stunned German observers. Landing craft tank, LCTS, disgorged 30-ton Sherman tanks directly onto the beaches. Landing ship tanks, LSTs, massive vessels 328 feet long, beached themselves and opened bow doors to discharge entire tank companies. DUKW amphibious trucks swam ashore, drove up the beach, and delivered supplies directly to combat units. By nightfall, the Allies had landed approximately 156,000 troops, 132,715 by sea, and 23,400 airborne. This force exceeded the entire German 7th Army defending Normandy. In the first 24 hours, the documented Allied achievement included 156,000 personnel, 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, 15,000 tons of supplies. The German 7th Army, defending the entire Normandy region, possessed fewer than 500 operational tanks. The Allies landed 3 times that many on the first day. The German response to the invasion revealed not just material inferiority, but systemic breakdown in the face of overwhelming enemy capability. The legendary panzer divisions, which had conquered France in 6 weeks in 1940, found themselves paralysed by Allied air supremacy and naval gunfire. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armoured unit close enough to intervene on D-Day, began its counterattack at 4 p.m. The division took 3 full hours to move the 10 miles from Ranville to and through Caen. What should have been a devastating armoured thrust became a tragic procession of burning vehicles. When the surviving panzers finally engaged British forces near Sword Beach, they encountered naval gunfire directed by forward observers. HMS Warspite, monitoring from 15 miles offshore, fired 15-inch shells that could penetrate any tank ever built. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 25th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment, would later write in his memoirs, "The enemy's material superiority was so great that our own strength was swept away like a wave breaking on a rock." On June 7th, D-Day +1, German reconnaissance aircraft brought back photographs that senior officers initially refused to believe. The Allies were building harbours, not capturing ports, building them from nothing in the open sea. The Mulberry harbours represented industrial capability on a scale that challenged comprehension. Prefabricated in Britain, these artificial ports consisted of 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 jetties, 10 miles of floating roadways, 93 ships deliberately sunk as breakwaters. Within 2 weeks, the Mulberry harbours were handling 9,000 tons of supplies daily, more than many French ports. The Germans had spent 4 years building the Atlantic Wall to protect the ports. The Allies had simply eliminated the requirement for ports. Throughout June 1944, German commanders gradually realised the completeness of their intelligence failure. The elaborate deception of Operation Fortitude had convinced German intelligence that the Normandy landings were a feint. The real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, led by Patton's fictitious 1st United States Army Group. For crucial weeks, German reserves remained frozen, waiting for an invasion that never came. General der Panzertruppe Leo Geyer von Schweppenburg, commanding Panzer Group West, discovered the deception when captured documents revealed Patton's actual location, in Normandy, commanding the very real Third Army. As June progressed into July, German officers' reports to higher headquarters became increasingly desperate. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, received a call from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel at OKW demanding to know why the invasion hadn't been thrown back into the sea. When Keitel asked what should be done, Rundstedt famously replied, "Make peace, you fools! What else can you do?" For this honesty, Rundstedt was immediately relieved of command. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel met with Hitler on June 17th at Margival, France. According to documented accounts, Rommel presented statistics showing the hopelessness of the German position. Complete Allied air supremacy, German divisions at 30% strength, and the impossibility of daylight movement due to naval gunfire. Hitler's response was to forbid any retreat, demanding fanatical resistance. Rommel left the meeting knowing Germany was doomed. Within a month, he would be implicated in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler and forced to commit suicide. Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff who survived the war, would later write in Invasion 1944, Rommel and the Normandy Campaign. We were not defeated by better soldiers or superior strategy. We were buried under an avalanche of material. The battle for Caen demonstrated the futility of German resistance against Allied material superiority. On July 7th, 467 RAF heavy bombers dropped 2,500 tons of bombs on Caen in 40 minutes, more explosive power than the entire Luftwaffe possessed in France. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, one of Germany's best units, entered the Normandy battle with 20,540 men and 150 tanks. After 6 weeks, it had 300 men and no tanks, losing 8,000 soldiers in the Falaise Pocket alone. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy beginning July 25th, provided the final demonstration of Allied supremacy. 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers dropped 3,300 tons of bombs in a concentrated carpet bombing attack, targeting an area just 6,000 by 2,200 yards. General-Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division positioned directly under the bombardment, reported, "My division has been annihilated. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an industrial complex." The Panzer Lehr, which had entered Normandy with 190 tanks and 16,000 men, simply vanished. Of 3,000 men in the targeted area, 1,000 died instantly, 1,000 were wounded, and 1,000 were too psychologically shattered to fight. The operation's tragic friendly fire incidents killed 111 Americans and wounded 490, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking U.S. officer killed in action in the European theatre. Yet even these casualties were absorbed without affecting the operation's success. The Falaise Pocket from August 12th to 21st, 1944, became the graveyard of German forces in Normandy. The documented statistics were apocalyptic: 10,000 to 15,000 Germans killed, 40,000 to 50,000 captured, 344 tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed in the northern sector alone, 2,447 soft-skinned vehicles abandoned, 252 artillery pieces lost. Between 20,000 and 50,000 Germans managed to escape the encirclement, but as disorganized remnants rather than fighting units. The German General Staff struggled to comprehend that they were not fighting a military campaign, but an industrial equation. The 1944 production comparison starkly illustrated Allied industrial dominance. German production, 1944. Aircraft, 39,807. Tank production peak, 1,854 monthly, December. Military trucks, 68,000. American production, 1944. Aircraft, 96,000. Tanks, 29,000. Military trucks, 650,000. These statistics didn't include British, Canadian or Soviet production. Germany was fighting the entire world's industrial output with the production capacity of a medium-sized nation increasingly reduced by bombing. Total American wartime production included 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. General Franz Halder, former Chief of the General Staff, calculated after the war. By 1944, the Allied advantage in war production was approximately 5-1. In certain categories like trucks, it was 10-1. We were not defeated. We were mathematically eliminated. The German officers who survived Normandy were psychologically transformed. They had witnessed not just military defeat, but the complete invalidation of Nazi ideology about German superiority and American weakness. Young officers who had grown up under Nazism were particularly affected. They had been told Americans were soft, spoiled by luxury, unable to fight. Instead, they discovered Americans had machines to do the hard work, radios to coordinate, abundant ammunition to practice with, and confidence from unlimited support. The suicide rate among German officers spiked dramatically. Defeat was one thing. The complete invalidation of their worldview was another. Beyond mere quantity, German officers confronted a technology gap that revealed how far behind Germany had fallen. Proximity fuses turned anti-aircraft fire into precision killing. Radar-directed naval gunfire could hit targets miles inland with first-round accuracy. DUKW amphibious trucks solved logistics problems Germany couldn't even conceptualize. The Allied use of specialized vehicles particularly impressed German officers. Hobart's funnies, modified tanks that could clear mines, lay bridges, destroy bunkers, solved tactical problems through engineering rather than blood. Throughout the Normandy campaign, German officers developed a particular dread of naval gunfire. The battleship HMS Rodney's 16-inch guns could fire 2,048-pound shells 23 miles inland. The USS Nevada, USS Texas, and HMS Warspite turned their main batteries into super-heavy artillery that could obliterate any target. German artillery attempting counter-battery fire against naval vessels learned the futility of their task. Ships moved. They also shot back with. By July 1944, German movement in daylight had become virtually impossible. Allied fighter bombers operating in cab ranks, controlled by forward observers, could strike any target within minutes. The statistics were overwhelming. Allied aircraft in theatre, 12,000 plus. German aircraft, 300 to 500. Allied sorties per day, 5,000 to 8,000. German sorties, 50 to 100 when possible. The final statistics from the Normandy campaign told the story of industrial warfare Allied achievement, June 6th to August 30th, 1944. Personnel landed, 2,052,299. Vehicles landed, 438,471. Supplies landed, 3,098,259 tons. Aircraft sorties, 480,000 plus. German losses in Normandy. Killed, 240,000. Captured, 200,000. Tanks, assault guns lost, 2,200. Divisions destroyed, 40 plus. In 1954, 10 years after D-Day, surviving German officers gathered in Bonn for a private symposium on the Normandy campaign. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, who had served as Chief of Staff to both Rundstedt and Klug, delivered the keynote address. We learned in Normandy that war had changed fundamentally. It was no longer a contest of armies, but of economic systems. We counted divisions while they counted factories. We measured courage while they measured production. The image that haunts me still is the sight of American bulldozers pushing aside our destroyed tanks to clear roads for their supply trucks. The German officers who witnessed D-Day were permanently transformed. Hans Speidel became a NATO general, helping integrate West Germany into the Western Alliance. Many Normandy veterans became advocates for European economic integration, understanding that only by pooling resources could European nations hope to match American industrial capacity. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy, compared his experience with those who fought in Normandy. In Italy, we could fight the Allies on relatively equal terms. In Normandy, on open ground where they could deploy their full industrial might, our forces were simply erased. On June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Walter Ohmsen returned to Crisbecq Battery as an honoured guest. The former Oberleutnant Walter, now 73, stood at the same observation post where he had first sighted the invasion fleet. Speaking to gathered veterans, both Allied and German, he reflected, "40 years ago, I stood here and saw the impossible, a sea covered with ships from horizon to horizon. I knew in that moment that everything I had been told was wrong. Weak nations don't build 7,000 ships. Divided nations don't coordinate such an invasion. I fired my guns at that armada, and I might as well have been throwing stones at the tide. We sank one destroyer, damaged a few others. For every ship we hit, 100 passed unharmed." Young officers today study tactics from Normandy. But the real lesson is simpler. In modern war, the side that can produce the most wins. We learned that industrial capacity is military capacity. The sea of ships I saw that morning was not just an invasion fleet. It was American industrial might made visible. The German officers who watched nearly 7,000 Allied ships approach on D-Day witnessed more than an invasion. They witnessed the future of warfare, where industrial capacity would trump every other consideration. The image that haunted them, that impossible armada stretching from horizon to horizon, was the physical manifestation of democracy's latent power unleashed, of industrial might applied to military purpose on a scale that rendered traditional military virtues irrelevant. They had prepared for war. They met instead the full industrial capacity of the United States. The German officers who watched those ships knew in that moment of terrible clarity that they were witnessing the end of war as they understood it and the birth of something new. Industrial warfare on a scale that made their professional expertise obsolete. Their defeat was not military but mathematical, not tactical but industrial, not a failure of courage but a shortage of trucks. It was a lesson written in steel across the waters of the English Channel on June 6, 1944, when nearly 7,000 ships announced that American industrial might had come to Europe, and nothing would ever be the same again.